I'm Big Don Luca, smoke you like my hookah. Pump fake right, then I step back in illusion. That's a boss move maneuver, billionaire entrepreneur. Mark Cuban on the viewer, put you rookies on a skewer. I stay shitting on you boys like I came up from the sewer. Used to have a lot of dollars, now I got a lot fewer. What you saying to me? I hope you save it for me. I'm about to kill the game, and I put it in my testimony.
Hi, welcome back to the Mainstream Mavs podcast. This is your host, Will. I'm joined here in person, of course, again by my co-host, Jaren.
What is up, guys?
Trying to ramp up the in-person content here as we approach the draft, just having my confidant here closely with me, it just gives me an increasing sort of confidence when we're going over these profiles. Jaren, what about you?
Absolutely. I think it's always a fun little cherry on top to be with the Will Miller in person.
Yes, it's such a blessing. But today, guys, we have a blessing for you guys. We are going to be going over some more draft profiles, some more guys that I would say are kind of more tentatively projected in the actual range of which the Mavericks are picking in. Maybe more of a healthy prognosis that we're rolling with here in this episode than our previous renditions in our draft profiles. If you haven't watched those already or listened to them, make sure to go check them out. You can find us on YouTube, of course, or Apple Podcast or Spotify. We just did draft profiles that are up everywhere on our Twitter, where you can find our Twitter at mainstream _ or just mainstream 214. It's our new Twitter, but we posted all our new draft profiles and stuff there over there. So go check that out. But we got Ozzer Thompson, Grady Dick, Jarius Walker, Taylor Hendricks, as well as Anthony Black up right now. So, a lot of those guys that definitely have a little bit more of that volatility range to them where they could slide. One of them is probably going to potentially slide to where the Mavericks are sitting at 10. But all of them are definitely, in a sort of echelon of their own compared to maybe some of the guys that we're talking about today. But some of the guys today, definitely, I would say, have some more swing factors that if they were able to really harness in terms of their own game and improve upon throughout the course of their NBA career, could be just as talented as some of the sort of more ready, surefire prospects with inside the top 10 that we've already profiled. So, without further ado, today we're going to be getting into Kentucky guard Cason Wallace, Michigan combo guard Kobe Bufkin, and then Metropolitan 92. I would say, I guess, kind of like wing / potentially, point of attack defending guard. Bilal Coulibaly. He played with Victor Wembanyama. So those are all guys that have kind of been, as high really, projected as like 10 landing with the Mavericks, or as low as, early 20s. So, there is some volatility as we talked about, but these are all, kind of coveted sort of point of attack defenders in one, sort of form or fashion or the other that we'll be talking about today. They do all have different properties. Some of them are a little bit more like wings. Some of them can handle the ball a little bit better. Some can shoot better. Some, maybe a little bit more ready now, compared to, some, I wouldn't say draft and stash, but, in like Bilal Coulibaly's case, he definitely has a lot more of a developmental track to go than the other two guys coming out of college, and Kobe Bufkin and Cason Wallace. So some pretty cool ones that we're going to be getting into today. Definitely did some good homework on all three of these guys, and we feel pretty good about them. Also, we got a lot more stuff, aside from profiles coming out here in the coming days. We're going to be doing our profile over Derek Lively as our next podcast, but in tandem with that is also going to be us talking about scenarios for the Mavericks as the draft approaches, in terms of if they would be open to trading back. I'm obviously inclined to think that they definitely would be, but we'll be going over, maybe some specific scenarios, bring up a few examples, as well as kind of dishing out our own opinions on that in tandem with doing that Derek Lively draft profile. So that'll be an exciting one. We've already done our homework and stuff, took our notes on that. And then we'll be hashing out probably a few more profiles. And then, we'll probably just do some sort of big picture kind of question podcast where we kind of, take a narrative in regards to the upcoming draft or free agency, and just kind of talk about it, because, the draft is on Thursday, and we're going to be live streaming it. We're going to be having it all on Twitch. We're getting that all set up for you guys. So we're excited for that. But, we're really trying to ramp up as we approach that. So it's an exciting time to be an NBA fan. especially if your team got rebuked from the playoffs, or just didn't make it in the first place, of course. And you kind of been in the Sahara, gasping for water. In our case, just gasping for Mavericks content.
Yeah.
So, and that's where we're at right now, Jaren. So, what is your happiness level, Jaren? We never get to check in on something like this on the podcast. What's your happiness level as we approach the draft here, or excitement level? You can kind of
we'll go with
together.
it. Yeah, we'll go with grouping it together rather.
Yeah.
I mean, I think there's a lot to be excited about. There's a lot to be happy about. There's actual like NBA news as a whole, and that's with the draft coming up and this whole Bradley Beal saga. There's just a lot of smoke coming up. Of course, the new rumors of the Clint Capella. All these trades, it definitely brings some insight to I guess just how antsy everyone is getting on, especially the Dallas forefront of things. So I mean, I'm more so excited, more so just seeing how things will pan out. I'm not saying I expect a trade or anything to happen here in the next few days, but I think come Thursday, I think we'll be ready for whatever is to happen, because I don't think we won't absolutely be ready. We will not be ready. That is one thing that we have come to know as Mavs fans, is we will never be ready for that. But yeah, I'm looking forward to whatever does happen. I mean, it's going to be content at the end of the day, so we'll be able to fill you guys in. And I mean, I think for the first time in probably over a month, there's like for real good topics, good news. Of course, with these draft profiles and with the draft coming up, and potential trade targets, because this team has to move. And so they have to make moves. And I mean, I'm really looking forward to see what happens.
Yeah, I mean, obviously we've talked about this, that the Mavericks hand is basically completely forced. The clock has been, completely turned back counterclockwise. They are, in a position where they essentially have to make moves, or they risk, their potential transcendent franchise superstar leaving in a couple years. And, that's just the blunt truth in all this, even if it's a smaller likelihood, even if he remains loyal. It's just a precarious position that they have, of course, put themselves in through years of draft and off-season mismanagement. So their hand is forced to make multiple moves, hopefully this upcoming summer. So they just have to hit the nail on the head with them. Less Wes Iwundu, Gal Meckel type of moves. More of those Al-Farouq Aminu type, sort of moves. Because I mean, hitting within the margins is going to be key too, because the Mavericks may not hit on some of these bigger moves that they're making in the this upcoming offseason. So we will have to see, just in terms of how they take the young players, with the draft, as well as like summer league and how the whole offseason undrafted free agent saga kind of unfolds. There's multiple outlets to them getting better than this summer, barring just trades and free agency. So it'll be an interesting dynamic to monitor going forward. But, without further ado, we're excited to get after it these next couple of weeks with the content, of course. But, of course, with these draft profiles today, before we get into them, here's going to be an ad from our sponsor from Spotify for Podcasters. All right, getting into it here, Jaren. Starting out here with Cason Wallace, covering this individual, Jaren, great point of attack defender, a guy that, kind of projects as possibly a pseudo playmaker, especially at the NBA player. And, I know the root of pseudo kind of means fake. And we've used that to describe a lot of the ball handlers with the Mavericks. But, from the perspective more so that he wouldn't necessarily be a fake ball handler. But he's a guy that, wouldn't even really think be tasked coming into the NBA, even as a secondary ball handler, but definitely an individual who could help with that aspect, a decent catch and shoot shooter, a pretty sort of ready-made prospect here. I'd say he has the least bust potential, comparable maybe to the other two guys in terms of, finding a definitive sticking role in the NBA. That might just be my opinion. I don't know, but I mean, he definitely projects as, that sort of versatile 6'4", 6'5", kind of smaller-ish, sort of two, that can cover 1 through 3 comfortably. He's got good size on him. Definitely, comparable to maybe like a Lou Dort or a Marcus Smart. And, we'll talk about that, of course, more specifically when we get into the NBA comparisons and stuff. But what did you get out of this guy, having covered, his draft videos and stuff like that, and having watched some of his tape, what do you think are some of the more positive aspects he could bring to this Mavericks team?
Yeah, overall, I think that he's just a solid two guard. I don't think that he needs the ball in his hands necessarily to stick out or to make plays necessarily. I think he's, offensively, that's sort of where his struggles do lie. But offensively, I think he has a really good motor. And like I mentioned before, he's a really good two guard. He's not going to have the ball in his hands a whole lot, but he can create whenever the ball is in his hands. He's a really good pick and roll sort of playmaker, not afraid to make the tough passes, not afraid to make the lob pass over tall guys. And he has a pretty good ability of finding guys in the opposite sort of court. Like he can flip the court really well compared to some other guys in this draft class. But really where the sort of positives really do lie is in his defense. He's a really, really good point of attack defender. I know that, as you said, like we'll get into his role a little bit more. But I really do view him day one as a guy who can come off the bench and make an immediate impact on whoever he is guarding. I think out of these three guys that we're going to cover, to me, I think he's the most ready defensive made player. Maybe even in this draft, just, as a point guard or a two guard sort of guy, a guy who can guard 1 through 2. I think he might be the best in the league at this, or sorry, best in his draft class at this. But yeah, Cason Wallace, a guy, he's just got good basketball IQ. As I mentioned before, he can, his defense translates to the pro level really easily. I think he's going to have a really good ability, as I said before, to, maybe not necessarily these top tier point guards in this league, like a Damian Lillard or something like that. But I think that you can stick him on a two guy, someone coming off the bench. And yeah, you can expect him to go to work there. I don't think day one he's going to be that necessarily primary defender on those tough point guards. But yeah, I mean, he can work on a lot, as we mentioned. His offense was the biggest sort of question mark, but he does have some upside, as I said before, with the playmaking, also some finishing upside. He's got a really good angle driving, a really good screen navigator as well, and he can snake the pick and roll really well. I saw a lot of his sort of kind of dicey assists come from snaking the pick and roll and getting a screen off to the big guy. And also not just that, but he's a good off-ball mover. He's not afraid to sort of rotate into the pockets, get in between the defensive corners and sort of not necessarily cut off ball. He's not necessarily the best backdoor cut by any means, but he can move off ball, and he can also, he's good at, I guess, making that secondary pass. He's not afraid to pass up good passes for the better shot is what I'm trying to say. But yeah, I was really impressed with his sort of defensive impact. I think his defensive impact is definitely where his pro readiness level is definitely where it's at.
Yeah, I mean, I know you said that you would be remiss to, admit that he could maybe step in day one and guard some of the best point guards, best primary ball handlers at the NBA level. And I mean, I think that there's some hesitancy with any rookie to come in and say that they could do that, and have that immediate day one impact. But this is definitely an individual that, in terms of his trajectory, that projects, I think, a lot easier and probably a lot faster to be able to do that than some of the other guys that we'll talk about. I wouldn't say that he's, the ultimate position of need for the Mavericks, but his defense is, earnestly second to none, or else, we wouldn't, just be up here talking about a sort of tried and true point guard who, can only, really suffice in terms of his offense, because the Mavericks, while that is sort of a ancillary, maybe even kind of like tertiary need, it's definitely not something at the top of their bucket list here. And look, like, this is a guy that can defend 1 through 3. He can guard up a little bit. He has a really good base. He's very stout.
Yeah.
He's got really good strength. For the college level, he's very aggressive. He wins a lot of 50-50 balls. He's not afraid to get onto the floor. He's got a really good basketball IQ. Jaren obviously talked about his ability to, make those extra passes. He's a really good, at just continuing the ebb and flow of the offense. He doesn't, get too selfish or let his own prerogative disrupt what's going on offensively for the team. And, he showcased that at Kentucky. He had a good willingness to find cutters, make the open pass. He also, as Jaren had talked about in the pick and roll, there's still probably another added layer of comfortability he can get there. Just in terms of his whole playmaking arsenal, he's going to have to definitely open up his dribble package a little bit more to be able to get to his spots, not only from a playmaking perspective to, be able to draw a little bit more pressure from defenses to make some of those tougher passes. But also from a shot creation standpoint, he's going to have to work on that as well. But, that's if he's going to really expand past, just that role player sort of tier in the NBA. He's, I hate bringing out the comparisons this early, but I mean, he is almost like a 1-for-1 comparison in terms of, if things do go right for him, to like a Lou Dort or a Marcus Smart, just a, really savvy sort of maybe undersized 2 guard, can attack off closeouts, be a little bit more dynamic, is pretty good. He's reliable. He's going to make the defense pay from 3. But that's, he's not an above average shooter. I definitely think he'll come in, probably be in that 36-37% sort of range. At least, if the primary sort of shot diet of his attempts are going to be catch and shoot threes, in his rookie year, in terms of those threes that he's going to be taking. Because at Kentucky, there were some instances, where he was delegated some more, ball handling opportunities, obviously, than he's going to have at the NBA level. He's not going to, get as many chances, specifically, in the context of a team like the Mavericks that is trying to win next year, in all hope, at least. So, there were instances at Kentucky where, he would reject a screen, or a defender would go under and he would pop that open, pull up 3, and he didn't have the hugest reliability with it, but his shot mechanics are pretty good. He's got a little bit of a sort of elongated motion with his the way he kind of shoots. It's kind of, you wish he'd maybe get a little bit more arc on his shot. He'd have a higher release point. But I think at the end of the day, he does have pretty fluid shot mechanics. He's a guy that can come in and, really be that point of attack defender that the Mavericks are looking for now. In terms of getting reps in the starting lineup, I don't know how, ready and surefire of a process that would be, comparable to some of the other guys we may talk about, just because his role is, even though he can guard up a little bit and can do so very successfully, probably guarding at least like 3s with that 6'4", height and the, about 6'6" wingspan. And just in terms of how stout he is, he's not a guy that is going to be switchable beyond that, just, strictly due to his size. He did show the ability to have really good active hands, be a really good help side defender.
Yeah.
He's really good at probing off ball.
I believe he averaged 2 steals, I think.
Yeah, he averaged he averaged over 2 steals a game, I believe it. He's like really good at hedging and recovering. I mean, great off ball defender too. And I didn't even mention that. He's good at exploiting passing lanes, just rotating and closing out. I mean, he really does do everything, all in between. Like, this is a guy that I tend to only give this label out to guys that make an impact so much on this end that they would be almost considered a game changer from this perspective, as they would be offensively. But I would say he's like a splashy defensive player. Like, he could be an all NBA defensive player. And if any of the offense comes along more so than just a complementary role, where he can be delegated some of those secondary playmaker responsibilities and those transition playmaking opportunities, if he can ever actually develop into more of a self-creating role, this could be one of those guys that you look back in a couple years like, why didn't this guy go top 5? But as of right now, I mean, he just projects really well defensively. I know point of attack defense isn't necessarily the biggest need for the Mavericks, for a team that wants to get some size on the wings, provide a little bit more, not just point of attack defense, but at those wing spots, with as dynamic as a lot of these, sort of point forwards are in today's game, be able to guard up on guys like that, like Paul George, Kawhi Leonard, the just, absolute abundance of wings in the NBA that are non-one dimensional, something that is sort of a scarcity for us Mavericks fans to see in person. But no, I mean, he's a guy that is going to be able to handle 1 through 3 defensively, and at times I think even overcompensate for other lackluster defensive performances from maybe other guys in the guard spot. Particularly if he's playing with Luka or Kyrie, he can guard the toughest guy and then also provide some of that off ball sort of help defense as well. He's very smart in terms of if he when he's creeping up on guys. He's also not he doesn't overextend himself a whole bunch. He doesn't get too out of position. You know, there were maybe a few times that he took too hefty of a risk at Kentucky, and he kind of tried to chase over a screen, or he tried to come from behind on somebody, where at the NBA level they would have been able to pass out of that or get in triple threat position and make him pay. But I mean, other than that, you're looking at a pretty multifaceted defender here at the guard spot that would definitely take a lot of pressure off Luka and Kyrie. When their primary offensive responsibilities sometimes tend to override what they have to do on defense throughout the course of a long 82-game season.
Absolutely. I think to highlight some more improvements, like I think he could improve on his sort of his offensive creation. I think he lacks a little bit of offensive creation, especially in the one-on-one sort of scenario. I think he went to a variety of moves, but just kind of one-dimensional moves, never really got too creative with his dribbles, never got really too creative with his sort of like step-throughs or Euro steps, sort of things of that nature. Didn't really get too creative with that. He was a good finisher, but he lacked sort of, I guess, the creative finishes, which I think that are going to sort of finesse more or sort of work more at the pro level. Like I think you can get away with the sort of A to B sort of finishes in the college level, but
he definitely had an over reliance. I'm not trying to butt in, but he like to your point, like he was over reliant on his athleticism to finish on a lot of these plays.
I think that just sort of highlights some of the more works. In terms of defense, I know you highlighted it, but just sort of screen navigating. He almost sort of played hero ball on defense a little bit too much, sort of what we saw at the tail end of the season from Josh Green, where, he's just kind of picking and choosing his matchups, going under on screens whenever he should have went over, or vice versa, sort of scenarios like that, like little things that you can work on over time that just kind of are disciplinary things. But definitely like, if he doesn't improve upon those could definitely hurt his sort of ceiling at the end of the day. But yeah, to highlight some of his more shooting struggles, because I think that's one of the bigger things coming in. His 3-point shot necessarily wasn't, awful by any means. I think he just struggles with consistency. He shot actually 40%, I believe 2/3 of the season. In the last 9 games of the season, he shot 18.2% from 3. So I think he's just kind of struggles with consistency. Had it improved, had it went from like 18% at the beginning of the year all the way up to 40%, I think we'd be having a much different discussion. But because of such variety, or not variety, but the big drop off, I think it is a sort of call for concern. Not just that, but also his mid-range pull-ups, didn't really rely on that too much, but being a pick and roll navigator that he's going to have to kind of be, he's going to have to rely on that mid-range jumper just a little bit more than, what he kind of did. But he shot 39.5% from mid-range jumpers. Not terrible, but can definitely work on that. Also, his floater game, that sort of in-between number, this is sort of an eye-popping number to me, only 35%. That number is going to have to go way up at the professional level, of course. And I think that's why, going into his role, I think that, likely he will be more of an off-ball sort of 2-guard. Not saying that this is going to be his role at all, but kind of like the Tyrese Maxey to James Harden, where, he can bring the ball up, but you're not going to necessarily run every offensive play through him. But yeah, he can take some limitations off, if Kyrie or if Luka, assuming Kyrie does come back, like if that were to be a starting lineup, he could definitely take the sort of, I guess, ropes on defense, and let those guys go to work on offense. And I think that's sort of, if the Mavericks were to go in that route, again, I don't really know how feasible they were. I do believe they worked him out, if I'm not mistaken.
I believe they did. Yeah.
So, there could be a world where he is drafted here. But yeah, I think his ideal role will probably be a 2-guard off the bench day one. But yeah, I wouldn't be surprised to see him play some spot starter minutes at some point in the season.
Yeah. I think with the Mavericks more specifically, that's where he's going to be relegated to coming off the bench, especially with the ascension of Jaden Hardy and, Josh Green. There's definitely going to be some, sort of intertwining in terms of how those guys all project positionally. If this guy were to get drafted, he would be having to fight for minutes in the rotation. I'm sure they could all work it out, but it may be a little clunky at first. To Jaren's point, the jump shot is like the biggest work in progress for him. He's good at knowing how to create space in terms of, those pull-up jumpers. Just in terms of like a basketball IQ perspective, he doesn't have the, just most full sort of array of dribble moves to, be able to kind of throw at his own disposal, but he is really good at, understanding when to reject a screen or when a defender goes under, when he's going to have space to shoot. And I mean, he did make defenses pay earlier in the season, but, as the season sort of treaded along, the shooting numbers obviously fell off a little bit, to Jaren's point. So, I mean, just being more reliable, more comfortable in those, pull-up scenarios is going to be big. At least just being respectable, I think is going to be the biggest drawing point for him throughout his career, and just getting a little bit more savvy with some of those drives. I know we compared him to Marcus Smart, but Marcus Smart is a guy who is extremely, diligent at, understanding that he may not be the most athletic guy, but he's always kind of crafty using like Euro steps and different types of floaters to be able to, really hone in on those like giant killers and stuff like that. And, make opposing bigs, think twice that he's, just a defensive player when he's attacking from the rims, and Cason Wallace, he definitely is kind of like a younger, rawish sort of Marcus Smart, where if he can evolve upon those things, he's going to be really hard to stop, because I would say he's a lot more athletic maybe
potentially
than Marcus Smart coming in. Like just when they came in, he's a little bit more rangy. So if he can get that floater down and understand, that he can keep his dribble alive and still get a shot up over a rim protector, things like that are going to, help sort of hinder that over reliance on athleticism when he's, attacking from the wing position, or in a one-on-one scenario. But, he's already a decent cutter. When he does get going downhill off of a dribble handoff or a curl off, he comes down, with a lot of speed. So he's fairly tantalizing going to the rim, but just evolving upon some of those things is going to be the biggest drawing point in terms of where he can really improve the most as a player, right? And to kind of summarize the whole positive and negatives of this, I mean, I would not, be I definitely wouldn't be angry if the Mavericks selected this guy at 10. I would talk myself into the pick, and it's not even as much the player as it just kind of is the role. He has a lot of positive flashes, and I mean, he could really evolve into something at some point, but it would create sort of a log jam at a position that I wouldn't say the Mavericks already, all the way have covered, but it may just be, a sort of tertiary position of need comparable to some of the bigger issues on the roster.
Absolutely. I think that you honestly worded that really well. There is some, bigger sort of needs that this team has, and I don't think that he would necessarily fill those other than the sort of point of attack defender that this team needs. But, my expected role if he were drafted to Dallas, again, I said this before, but just kind of being that sort of tertiary ball handler off the bench, a guy who's relegated more so to using his primary defense, and sort of his off-ball sort of movement, maybe even his off-ball catch and shoot, and those sort of corner shots. But I think he'd work well with Jaden Hardy, being his sort of off man, sort of things like that, like intangibles like that. But yeah, my expected role, I'm not necessarily thinking that he would jump Jaden Hardy in the sort of minutes rotation, day one at least. But he could definitely work up into that potential, assuming everything hits or assuming he starts developing his game. But yeah, I would expect him to come off the bench, and relieve sort of the defensive issues, at that primary attacking spot.
Yeah, no, I mean, from the point of attack perspective, with him and Josh Green, the Mavericks would definitely probably be covered if they were to select Cason Wallace at that, from that aspect. It would provide a lot of relief to Luka and Kyrie, but, guarding those bigger wings would still be a huge question for the Mavericks if they were to select Cason Wallace. In terms of his ceiling, if everything were to click for this guy, I think he could end up becoming a Drew Holiday, but maybe more consistent throughout his career. A guy that, potentially has, could see a few all-star appearances at certain points just due to, perpetual standing on an all defensive team and, being able to be a solid secondary playmaker or play second fiddle to a, 1A superstar in a system. I mean, he can be a really important player on a championship team if everything were to pan out throughout his career. I think in terms of his floor, you're looking at maybe like an Elfrid Payton type of guy, kind of rangier, good point of attack defender, but the NBA jump in terms of the shooting and the spacing that was provided for him was just too drastic of a leap possibly for him to make from a playmaking and shot creation and just shooting standpoint. He wasn't ready for it. But I think at the low end, he's at least a guy that's going to be able to make good passes within the flow of the offense, get to use his athleticism to get to some spots for, those driving kicks, get some good swing passes in there. So he at least could, I think, be at the end of a bench for a while before he fizzles out. But I do think that that is like his like rock bottom floor. Like that's if like everything were to go kind of astray from the offensive perspective. And I only say that just because, it is kind of hard to project how good of a defender a guy will be coming out of college. And then if his offensive limitations do hinder his game that much, he could see some issues from that perspective. But I do think he has a higher, I don't foresee him becoming that, but I think that's like the absolute floor. For his boomer bust rating, me personally, and for those of you guys that don't know, they're just like first listening to our draft profiles, the boomer bust rating is essentially how volatile the prospect is, like how, likely they are to either like just go off a cliff and, become an NBA superstar and, completely boom, or, become like Kwame Brown or something and just completely fizzle out and bust. So, it's just how volatile they are essentially. So out of 10, I would put him probably at like a 5. I mean, right in the middle, 5 or 6 for the boomer bust rating, because I think he's going to be a really consistent NBA player in his career. I just don't know if it's going to be in Dallas.
See, I was actually going to go with a way higher. I was going to go with a 7.5, just from the sense that, I think he's more of a safe fire pick. And at his absolute ceiling, I think he could potentially be.
Well, if he's more of a safe fire pick, then he'd be less volatile.
Okay, then my bad.
Yeah.
Then I would probably go with like a 4.5.
Okay.
Just because, I think that he could potentially be, like at his very best, I think he could be a defensive player of the year candidate. Sort of on the line of what Marcus Smart did in 2021. 2021 or 20, whatever year it was. But yeah, that's my absolute top of the top for him.
Yeah. No, so that is Cason Wallace for you guys there. I really like the player, but I just don't know if he's necessarily going to be the best fit for the Mavericks at 10 when they're lining up to select. Do you have any other lasting thoughts for him, Jaren?
Yeah, not really. I mean, other than the fact that I do think his defense will probably translate, but we're gonna have to see a little bit more. And yeah, I mean, his improvements are gonna have to be made on the offensive end for sure to see if he's going to stay in the league or not for at least an extended period of time.
Exactly. Next up, though, we'll be doing Kobe Bufkin, 6'5", 187 pounds, 6'8" wingspan, sophomore out of Michigan. He's a little bit taller, lengthier than Cason, but their games do have a lot of similarities across the board. But Kobe is definitely, I think, a little bit more dynamic offensively, less dynamic defensively. So some marginal differences there, but Kobe Bufkin, after, honing in on this guy, he definitely has one of the more impressive holistic games out of anybody in this draft. He doesn't have like a whole lot of glaring weak points, but he's also not extremely elite, I would say, at really anything. Maybe barring his transition playmaking and his attacking from that perspective, as well as his transition defense. I mean, he's just a really rangy athlete who gets up and down the court really well. But in the half court setting specifically, he's a pretty tantalizing driver. He gets downhill fast. This is like one of the faster guys I've watched on tape after having watched some of him. Has a really quick first step. He could definitely expand his dribble bag up a little bit more to be able to self-create a little bit more in those one-on-one scenarios. But for him, it almost looked like a lack of consistency from that aspect in terms of him nailing those looks. But I would say he's a lot better at creating space for himself than Cason Wallace is. He does have a little bit of trouble absorbing contact at the rim, but he's an overall pretty savvy finisher once he gets there. He knows how to adjust and, find those angles to get to his spots with inside the paint. Doesn't get over pressurized by opposing rim protectors too often. He definitely needs to improve on his floater game a little bit. But his overall basketball IQ with inside the painted area, once he's driving, he just doesn't panic I think, as much as some other people, which was really impressive for a rookie. He has really long strides. Once he blows past a guy, they find it really hard to recover. There were not many instances where a trailer or somebody that had to recover off a drive by Kobe Bufkin was able to recover enough to even affect his shot a lot of the time. He's a great transition finisher, like I had talked about. He is just really dynamic in the open court. He never panics in 2-on-1, 3-on-1 scenarios. He, either finds the open guy on the fast break, or he, has effective stop and go sort of, dribbles and, in and out dribbles to, really screw with the defense when he's going full speed downhill. And conversely, on the defensive side of things, he is also, an NBA ready defender for sure. He's going to have to add some size and strength, and those are probably some of the biggest knocking points on that end, is being able to guard up a little, especially with his 6'8" wingspan. Being 6'5", he may at the NBA level need to guard threes just positionally a little bit more, and that's something that he's going to have to hone in on. But as he currently stands, he's a very savvy off-ball defender. Is really good rotationally. He's good at picking passing lanes. He's really good at closing out. Similarly to Wallace, he's just like really good at hedging and recovering. Coming up from behind guys, understanding defensive spacing, has really good court awareness. He won't let his man slip back door if it means that he's going to take a risk to poke the ball out from somebody that's like posting up at the nail or something like that while he's on the wing. He takes very calculated risks, and he's also a really good one-on-one defender. For what it is, I think that could maybe be hindered a little bit at the NBA level when he's going against stronger drivers. You can attack his hip a little bit more and get him to open his hips up a little bit more. He could definitely have a better base, but against college guys, he uses speed and athleticism really well defensively. When he got beat, he closed in on guys really well. He had a lot of recovery blocks, things of that nature. And against like ones and twos and smaller guys, I mean, he was really able to just, he honestly was a very hawking defender. And a lot of those guys, where there was a clear size disadvantage, almost had no chance. So it does give you a lot of promise if he is able to add that size, that he can be one of the more tantalizing defenders in the league.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that this is much more of a well-rounded out sort of prospect compared to Cason Wallace on the offensive end. Defensively, I think that there's a lot more questions to be answered, but, even defensively, I think that he has a lot of upside. I could definitely see at the professional level, where sort of his more intangibles, kind of like, sort of lack of physicality or sort of his smaller frame, I could see those things starting to catch up to him at the professional level, which is how, good guys are at getting to their spots, or, scoring, or even just taking advantage on slower defenders. And not saying that he's a slower defender at all, because I think he's a really good sort of recovery defender. As you mentioned before, he got a lot of help side blocks, or a lot of, just sort of got beat and recovered blocks sort of off the backboard type stuff. But yeah, I think that offensively is really where he's going to shine. I think, especially at the professional level, I think that we're going to see his game shine, because there's going to be a lot of better spacing compared to college. And not just that, but I think that he can really sort of, just like hone in on his abilities. He has a really good mid-range pull-up shot, has a really good ability to getting to the hoop. He has a very quick first step. I think that you mentioned that. But yeah, his ability to get to the hoop, his ability to sort of create one-on-one, definitely, sets him a level higher than who we just talked about with Cason Wallace. I think, Cason Wallace, as we said, was just much more limited offensively, whereas Kobe Bufkin offensively is just much more fluent, much more opened up. He can do everything that Cason Wallace can, and the ability that he can also be a good pick and roll creator, whether passing or even self-creating. His ability to snake those pick and rolls have honestly been really good,
and split them too.
Yeah, split them. Yeah,
he was able to get into the lane. He has a really good sort of like 1-2 dribble pull up that he kind of uses like those side dribbles. He has a good drag dribble to be able to, once he's getting pressured at the point of attack and a guy hedges really hard, he doesn't panic. He'll overlook the defense, kind of look over everybody, and try to find the best outlet. He's a solid cutter. I mean, he fills in the gaps. in almost every, facet offensively. But I don't think that, as good as he is, that he's a surefire, put the ball in his hands, ready playmaker at the NBA level. In terms of like that being like his primary role. I definitely think that, just like Cason Wallace, he probably on this Mavericks team, just due to how, clogged up that sort of position is, that 1 and 2 through 3 spot in terms of, the younger wings and Luka and Kyrie. If Kyrie is to stay, of course, we keep talking about Kyrie as if he's penciled in to stay, but he's obviously not. But I do think from that perspective, Cason Wallace, not Cason Wallace, but Kobe Bufkin can be, he can fill in the gaps offensively and do things like almost similarly to the way like Josh Green's doing, where, he can, be a guy that, facilitates out the short roll. He does have a good enough basketball IQ to do that. He can, be a guy that attacks off a closeout really hard and is able to score for himself. He's definitely a little bit better at just kind of, to put it like bluntly, just getting the ball in the basket than maybe like a Josh Green, for instance, but still holds the same sort of defensive weight that Josh Green could, especially if he's able to add some size to him. But like, to go back to my point about him not, being ready for that primary playmaking role, he was a sophomore in college. He did have to improve from that self creation and playmaking aspect a lot from, his freshman to sophomore year. And he did get stuck on his first read a lot, and he missed a lot of open guys at certain points. But when he hit them, it looked like really good. But the misses were also fairly blatant. So, just expanding his court awareness a little bit more, getting more comfortable in that realm for a guy that maybe, I don't know him personally, but I can, probably foresee that he probably played on the wing a little bit more when he was growing up, just based off how tall he is and, how coaches tend to like stick guys like that in AAU. Ever since he has evolved into, doing more of this sort of self-creation, his bag is really good. I think it's just, knowing when to use counter moves, knowing, when he should or shouldn't maybe take a isolation possession for himself and maybe, try one of those like spin post fadeaways that maybe won't be as effective at the NBA level. Just being able to diagnose that more and hone in on those things as he gets better throughout his career, from a playmaking and shot creation aspect are going to be integral points to him taking that next leap, to him, really being able to just do everything. But I do think that, I wouldn't say it's fool's gold, but some of the shot creation and playmaking, I think, is a little bit, of fool's gold at the NBA level in terms of how it will translate day one. But I do think just in terms of how fluid he is, with his dribbling and his shot, that, once he's able to hone in on the mental aspect of things, it'll be a fairly quick development for him to start to become more elite at some of those things.
Yeah, absolutely. And to highlight, some of his more weaknesses, as you mentioned before, just kind of consistency, I think, with some things. He could work on his screen navigation, as a lot of these rookies can. I think at the professional level, like that's definitely going to hurt his sort of ceiling, is if, his sort of screen navigating isn't there necessarily. Sort of kind of limited in guarding 1s and 2s. I think he can definitely work up into that sort of spot. Like he does guard 1s and 2s, but he's limited in sort of guarding 3s. At the NBA level, I think he projects more of a sort of not necessarily a wing defender, but as like a 2-guard defender. He's not going to guard the sort of point of attack guy, but he's going to guard the guy off that sort of like the Klay Thompson sort of thing.
Yeah, just kind of depending on who he's playing with, would be contingent on how he'd be used in a lineup like that. But also when you look at a guy like Cason Wallace, I just feel a lot more comfortable with his ability to switch on to some of those. If he gets stuck on a bigger wing, I'd feel a lot more comfortable with that than a Kobe Bufkin per se. But if Kobe, is tasked with having to defend a smaller guard because of his lateral quickness and, his size advantage, like I almost may feel more confident with him doing that than Cason.
Yeah, absolutely. To highlight a little bit more on the sort of weaknesses, I think sort of decision-making at times was a little questionable, sort of his either shot diet or just passes. I think that he tried to sort of thread the needle a little bit too much at times, either just with overconfidence or whatnot. But yeah, I think his shot diet, sort of more the fading away aspect of it. He could have gone strong up on some things, and would either fade away or use some questionable sort of moves to get to that sort of, whether it was a pull-up three or, inside the paint sort of post-scoring. But yeah, I think, he did, honestly well at sort of, I guess, scoring on sort of taller defenders or mismatches. But yeah, I think, his biggest thing to me is sort of needing to diversify his sort of offensive package, or just, sort of finding a consistent level at which he can score, and sort of knowing his strengths and weaknesses. I think that's probably the biggest thing for him to improve upon.
Yeah, but I mean, with that being said, he still is a pretty like surefire day one offensive guy. He's not one dimensional. He's going to come in and fill, a wide variety of needs for the Mavericks. But in the same vein of Cason Wallace, just because they are like fairly similar players, he isn't the best fit. He would definitely probably be one of those guys that's coming off the bench. Now, if he were to add a little strength, just because of his size, he's definitely, if he was able to, make enough of a, sort of defensive impact, a guy I could see the Mavericks sliding into that starting lineup, especially kind of depending on what happens with Kyrie. But it would just all depend on, his developmental track, as it kind of does with everybody. But, he definitely, just because of how dire the position of need that he is compared to maybe some other guys that the Mavericks will, be pining for, other positions of need they may have this offseason that they have to address. He probably wouldn't start day one. He'd probably be, an off the bench guard. In terms of his ceiling, if everything were to go right for this guy, he's almost like maybe like a left-handed like SGA or SGA light. Like he does have a very similar kind of build to that, but it would be very contingent upon his offensive game, just becoming, more and more evolved, more and more savvy. I'd say that he has one of the higher floors out of anybody that we've covered so far. I think at worst, you're looking at a good defensive guard off the bench who can at least, make spot up threes. Talked about his shooting a little, but he is a guy that, he's like I said, he has a good shot. He's comfortable in catch and shoot scenarios, but you'd like to just see him knock them in a little bit more of a consistent clip. But I do think the spacing the Mavericks would provide for him, as well as like how fluid his shot mechanics are, would bode for a good development in terms of his shot, progressively getting a little bit better. He is a guy that I could see at one point in his NBA career, like shooting around 40% if everything were to fizzle out for him. So, or not fizzle out, but if everything were to go right for him. So, yeah, I mean, I would say his floor is maybe, this is tough, like a manual quickly without like, maybe not as dynamic offensively.
Yeah, I could agree with that.
Yeah. Like, I mean, I feel like this guy, contrary to Wallace, like if his offensive limitations were to just be that bad, I feel like Kobe Bufkin is just a little bit more surefire in terms of at least being something in the NBA.
Yeah, I would actually agree with that point. Yeah, I mean, I think, I know you brought up the expect role sort of thing, but if you were drafted to the Mavericks, I think there would be a little bit of a logjam, more so more so than Cason Wallace. Cason Wallace definitely brings more of the defensive impact,
Right.
Kobe Bufkin's definitely more of the offensive impact. And with Jaden Hardy on the roster already, I just don't really think that there is a world where Kobe, is a Maverick, unless if we do end up trading either one of Josh Green or Jaden Hardy, at some point before the draft, which I, don't
Or
really,
during the draft.
or during the draft, yeah. Which, I don't foresee happening, but who knows nowadays. But yeah, I don't really think there is a world where he is going to be in Dallas. But as I said, or I guess as we said in the intro, you can't really expect anything nowadays. But yeah, as far as the ceiling and floor go, I relatively do agree with what you said. I think a ceiling level, I think he could be a high level scorer in this league, and then at the floor, just kind of a guy who, more an all around tool, not necessarily like Austin Rivers, but just kind of a guy who's off the bench who can sort of provide, and is a steady number. So I guess, now Will,
Oh yeah,
for the 1 out of 10 boom or bust rating.
I would probably give him like a 3 or a 4. I mean, probably like a 3. I mean, I just do think he's one of the more surefire prospects in this draft. I would maybe say a 4, just because I think maybe a 4 or a 5. I guess now that I'm rethinking it, just because I do think he has a lot of potential to hit on those swing factors that can make him really good. But he already has such a high floor that I think there's a little less volatility than some of the other guys here.
Yeah, I think I would probably go with a 5 just because, I think his intangibles, aren't necessarily like insane drop-offs. I think that those are things that he can definitely work upon. But yeah, the things that make his ceiling extremely well, or extremely high rather, I think that if he does improve upon those things and improve upon his sort of improvement areas, I mean, realistically, like I think that we could be looking at an all-star type guy. This could be the sort of Davion Mitchell of the draft potentially. If everything were to cut out and if everything were to, sort of work his way, and he could, like I said, potentially be an all-star type guy.
Yeah, no, I mean, Davion Mitchell, I wouldn't say is an all-star right now, but
Or not Davion Mitchell,
Donovan Mitchell. I was like,
Mitchell.
I was like, I knew what you were going for, but yes, he definitely could be the Donovan Mitchell of that late lottery if everything were to hit. Lastly, we'll be profiling Bilal Coulibaly from Metropolitan 92 from France, playing the same team as Victor Wembanyama, as we said in the intro. I apologize if I mispronounce the name. I'll probably continue to do so for any French listeners that we have. Just DM me what the actual pronunciation is phonetically. You can always DM us at mainstream 214 on Twitter.
Yes.
Figure we can get that figured out, and because we don't want to do a disservice or not give Bilal his due diligence here, because he's in the NBA draft and we're not at the end of the day. So, but at the end of the day, this guy is definitely a little bit more sketch in terms of being able to come in and make a day one impact compared to the other two guys. He's a lot more raw. He is projected in that sort of late lottery range as Cason Wallace and Kobe Bufkin were, but Bilal Coulibaly, 6'7", possibly, even listed at 6'8" from some draft outlets, 7'2" wingspan, only a measly 190 pounds though. He, I think, is honestly, I don't know exactly how to label his position, but if I had to call him anything, I'd probably say he's a 3, maybe
like a combo 2.
Maybe a combo 2. Yeah, like there is some ball handling upside here. But that's like a huge swing factor that is going to need to see a lot of improvement before that's something that he starts getting to be, delegated to actually, doing for an NBA team. It's going to be something that he's going to have to improve upon quite a bit. But some of the positives in terms of his game, before we get into the negatives, I think this is a little bit more of a clear dichotomy of, us being able to separate the positives and the negatives versus the other guys. There were a lot of good, things that they were like kind of good at or like, iffy on, but, Bilal has like his stuff that he's good at, and then his weaknesses are like pretty glaring. So in terms of the positives, he does have really good he has good intangibles. He's very like basketball offensively, just savvy in terms of understanding spacing. He's a really good cutter. His wingspan is able to, both positively affect his game offensively and defensively. He's definitely far and away the best athlete out of all three of these guys. Kobe Bufkin, probably, a faster guy, maybe more laterally quick. But Bilal also has still a really good first step. If he gets by you, he's going to use those strides to, rise up into a slam. He can jump off 1 or 2 feet, uses his wingspan to his advantage. He gets up very easily. And obviously, as all these guys that we talked about that have had pretty high motors so far, none of these guys I would say are slouches defensively or have shown like effort woes on that end. But Bilal specifically, he has a really high motor. He has great rotational defense, uses his wingspan to get in passing lanes as well as, hedge and recover. He can, there are a lot of instances, maybe contrary to the other guys, that he had to guard the dunker spot or he had to rotate over as the low man and, be a sort of pseudo rim protector at times. And he was able to do that with pretty solid success just due to how vertically sound he is. He plays good defense with his hands up against smaller guards. He can sort of hound them in the post there. He forced a lot of really bad shot clock or late shot clock attempts. There were a lot of closeouts that he had where he's rotating, where guys would just blatantly like miss threes at like the side of the backboard or, airball it. He really affects the field of vision, for an opposing shooter, contrary to maybe some of these other guys they may be more sound in terms of being able to stay in front of a guy, but Bilal, his athleticism is just really hard to see over. He runs the floor really well. He's a great, transition defender, as well as a, great offensive transition guy. Could probably get a little bit better at understanding driving angles, but his speed is so good in the open court that he's able to kind of just explode to the rim. He definitely, despite the slimmer frame, he has no problem going up on somebody. He projects himself and goes and even seeks contact a lot of the time when he's going to the rim, versus trying to, have a sort of finesse finish or something like that. He's a good rebounder for his size. He did, have some trouble with boxing out a little bit, especially with his frame. So that's something that could get worked on. But offensively, he's a good rebounder because he has the wherewithal to be able to use his length to go up and grab some of those 50-50 balls that, just may not even be applicable for some guys to even go for sometimes, but just being more positionally sound and boxing out is going to be something that's going to help him a lot. And he's, like I said, he's a good cutter from almost all angles, whether it be backdoor, taking a dive cut. The Mavericks could definitely get him downhill, I'm sure, running him off curl-offs, just going straight to the rim. Maybe like bust open some like UCLA screens, just get him going downhill because he's not scared of anybody in the paint. He's, he has a really quick sort of burst, I guess, in terms of like synchronizing into his jump. I don't know if you guys or if you've ever actually, Jaren, like watched any of those YouTube videos where they talk about techniques for jumping higher or like dunking or anything like that. But his I think it's his penultimate step where he, takes that step right before he goes directly into his jump is really good. So stuff like that are some of the more glaring positives, but conversely, Jaren, you can list off the limitations to his game.
Yeah, I think that there's, as you mentioned before we started or sort of dissected him, was that, his glaring weaknesses are probably like the highlight and probably what could control either where he lands in this draft or how his career pans out. But, his negatives are a little bit more glaring than, the other two that we did talk about. Kind of on defense, he relies on his length a little bit too much. There's a lack of strength there. So I think at the NBA level, it's really going to be a kind of test of, whether or not he's going to get bullied or not. It kind of has a weak base on defense, as I mentioned, just relying on his length a little bit too much to get blocks, affected shots really well, as you said, with his closeout. But yeah, I think he just relies on his sort of athleticism just a little bit too much to do things. And I don't think that's necessarily going to fly at the NBA level. Technically he did play at a professional level in France, but I guess, France and NBA is completely two completely different leagues. The other thing with me, and this is going to be really big, and yes, I could see the Mavericks honestly taking a flyer type pick on this guy, but he really needs to clean up his dribbles,
especially if they trade back, might I add.
Yeah, exactly.
If the Mavericks get a rim protector in a trade and they trade back maybe even like a few more spots and they're looking at like that 17, 18 range, like this guy would be really applicable if they're looking to add some wing depth off the bench. Absolutely.
But yeah, I think one of the things that this is going to necessarily dictate whether or not he's going to stay in the league for long periods of time. But, to me, he needs to clean up his dribbles. He needs to clean up his decision-making. His sort of dribble package is so not narrow, but just kind of limited in what he can do. A lot of times either driving in the lanes or just picking up his dribble. He was oftentimes stripped. And I think it's also a lack of strength, lack of, direction, places to be. He doesn't really get to his spots very well. Mm-hmm. And I think that sort of kind of affects him as his dribbles. Not just that, but, also his 3-point shooting. He didn't shoot at a high variable. He shot less than 83s this year. But, he shot the catch and shoot three at a 35%, sort of clip. And that's not necessarily good or bad, but just at the sort of limited shots
they were like wide open threes.
Yeah, exactly. There was a one game, I think, against Monaco or some other team in a playoff game where they directly sort of wanted him to shoot and he missed a lot of them. So I think that, NBA teams could adjust to that, leaving him wide open, having an extra help side defender, which, necessarily wouldn't be a benefit for the Mavericks. And not just that, but sort of clunky mechanics. I think the sort of blueprint for his jumper is there. I think he has a good jumper. I just think it's not fluid. As I said, it's more clunky than fluid. If he could work on his fluidity, I think that would be a key to sort of unlocking it all. And not just that, but as you said, he runs the floor very well. But in the half court scenario, not necessarily. I think that he'll be kind of hard to pair with Luka, just in the sense that I think he's more of a run and gun type of guy, a guy who, not cherry picking necessarily, but definitely runs the sort of transition, running up the floor as quick as possible type guy. His half court offense just wasn't necessarily there. And not just that, but I believe he averaged the most amount of turnovers on that Metropolitan 92 team with 18.1% turnover rating, which that was sort of on his floor. And not just that, but this is the big thing to me. Having a 7'4" or 7'5" Victor Wembanyama on your team, he really struggled at entry passes. A lot of the times a lot of his turnovers rather were sort of trying to pass it into the post with Victor in there. And oftentimes it was either just completely wrong side. Or Victor would go to front the guy, he'd pass the ball way too late or pass the ball way too early. And it'd be picked off by a weak side defender, or it'd be picked off by the guy that Victor was trying to front. I think he could definitely really work on that. And that, to me, is his biggest limitation.
Yeah, because I mean, even as slim in frame as Victor is, he is 7'5" and he's, pretty, undisputedly probably like one of the better players in that league. I mean, if you just look at it game to game, I mean, he's not a hard guy to get the ball to in an entry pass. I mean, especially with that length, probably easier than most NBA players. I mean, I know he can get thrown off base a little bit, but even so, his wingspan is just so big. So that was obviously pretty glaring that his passing is just not an area of comfortability whatsoever. I would honestly say it's one of his bigger weak points.
Yeah.
Like if there's one thing that I feel like I could, come in and do better than in terms of Bilal, it would probably be passing, just bluntly, straight up. And that's not even me trying to flex or anything. I'm nowhere near an NBA level prospect by any stretch of the imagination, but I'm more so trying to emphasize, contrary to some other prospects that we've covered and other guys where, we talk about a weakness, like the passing is as bad as it sounds. It is really bad.
Yeah,
it's really bad. So, the playmaking and the, evolution shooting wise is going to be huge. And those are going to be the hugest swing factors. But the other intangibles in terms of, cutting in the half court, his really rangy, defense, his athleticism, it could turn this guy into a superstar if everything were to go right, but it's going to be hard for him to hit on all those swing factors. Just as is, there's a lot of different variables at play there, but he is only 18. He's one of the younger guys in this draft. So we'll just have to kind of see what happens. As weird as it is, I think the Mavericks would honestly be a little bit more inclined to take him.
That's what I was thinking.
Because especially just kind of depending on the other picks that they make, because he does project as a guy that can defend. If everything were to go right and he added size, he could probably defend 1 through 4, 1 through 5 at some point in his careure.
Yeah, with that wingspan.
Yeah, with that wingspan, his lateral quickness, but it's gonna just depend on how that all ends up ironing out for him. Nonetheless, though, I do think if he came into the Mavericks, I don't think that he doesn't really strike me, especially as high as he's projected to be a draft and stash guy. I do think that he'd come over and try to develop day one. Now, where he ends up panning out in the rotation is all going to be conducive to his development and nothing more. I think day one, he'd probably be an off the bench wing for the Mavericks, and then he could end up being a starter by the end of the year if he develops somehow enough.
Yeah,
easily, just
he
based on his strength.
Into a Chris Boucher type.
Yeah, or he could end up playing more as a big rotationally if the Mavericks had some injuries and he had some size. But even then, there is probably gonna be some rebounding and sort of defensive woes when he has to guard up at the NBA level because of that lack of size sometimes. So it's really tough to pencil him into any one thing. But if he is able to hit on some of these markers, he's going to be a pretty tantalizing prospect going forward. I would say his ceiling is, it's honestly through the roof if everything were to hit. He's a really hard player to maybe kind of relate to.
Yeah.
I have a really good floor comparison for him, but I would say his ceiling maybe a baby Giannis. He's not going to be as dynamic because he doesn't have that quite. I don't think he'll ever get to that level of strength, and he's definitely not that long or tall. but he's a guy that could probably end up playmaking and shooting a little bit better. He has a mix of a lot of different guys in his game.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's hard to project, but I would say his floor is definitely like one of those more athletic type NBA players that just ends up not being able to make it because the other holes in their game completely override how high flying of an athlete they are. Who's that one guy that could like jump out the gym on the Mavericks earlier this year, like DJ Stewart?
Oh
yeah. No, I mean, like, he has the bust potential to where he could end up just being a G League guy. Like, if everything completely went to shit, in my opinion.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
And the offensive game didn't come along enough. But I think a good baseline in terms of where an equal sort of meeting point that we could maybe find for this guy, without saying that his ceiling would be too high, would probably be like Derrick Jones Jr. With a little bit better defense and hopefully throughout the course of his career a little bit better offense. But I think that's like kind of like a baseline player if he kind of just hits the mean in terms of all this. But he definitely has one of the higher boomer bust ratings. Very volatile prospect, as we talked about. I mean, I'm definitely saying he's like I'm definitely saying that this guy's maybe like a 9 or a 10 in terms of the boomer bust rating because of how volatile his projection could be.
Yeah, I was gonna go with a 8.5 because again his bust potential is really high.
Yeah, no, 100%. But unless you have any other outlying thoughts on Bilal Coulibaly, I guess we can go ahead and wrap it up. Definitely a little bit more volatile than the first two guys we talked about, but all of these guys in some sort of shape or fashion, I wouldn't say are out of consideration for the Mavericks to pick. I don't think any three of them are extremely likely. But any three of these guys, I don't think it wouldn't shock me if the Mavericks called their name, on draft night for any three of these guys.
I think Cason Wallace is probably the highest too, but yeah, I could definitely see them taking a stretch on like Bilal, or even a potential Kobe Bufkin pick. I'm not opposed to any of those guys.
Or selecting one of them and then trading them.
Yeah,
I can also see that too. So
and then having them turn out to be MVP.
Yes, we'll be back either tonight or tomorrow to do the Derek Lively podcast, or we talk about the Mavericks trading back in that scenario as well. So we'll get into that. But barring that, we're going to continue to churn out this draft content, talk about different scenarios the Mavericks could do, and get these draft profiles out. This has been a fun one. Thank you guys for listening this far in the podcast. Make sure to follow our Twitter at Mainstream214. Make sure to get at us on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or whatever other podcast platform you are listening. We are on almost any podcast platform you can find, whether it be like Apple or Amazon Music or Google Podcasts. It's all out there. Mainstream Mavs Podcast. Just search us up. Give us a 5-star rating. Give us a review if you do feel so inclined. We would appreciate the feedback. And make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to our YouTube as well, Mainstream Mavs Podcast. We appreciate you if you're listening live on YouTube, or not live, but if you're watching us on YouTube and you're actually seeing the video. Yes. You saw our setting change. We had a little bit of an abrupt setting change where we had to, from the intro of the podcast, we had to relocate, but we were able to finish it, and everything's all fine and dandy now here in Mainstream Mavs land.
Absolutely.
Yes. But like once again though, we appreciate you guys for listening this far. It's been a good one, and we will catch you guys next for the Derek Lively podcast, where we'll talk about what would happen if the Mavericks trade back in the draft.